Welcome back to Neuroconversion Leadership, where we talk about communication in the STEM workplace. I'm Jeremy Doran. I work with engineers, scientists, doctors, help them become better leaders, in addition to being great scientists, doctors, and engineers. Today, we're going to talk about neurodiversity. It's in the name of this podcast, so I guess we better describe exactly what it is and what it isn't. Let's get going. People will often walk up to me and say, "Oh, Jeremy, you have to watch this movie. I thought it was pretty good, but you are going to love it. You specifically are going to love it." And the reason why is because they thought it was a pretty good movie, but they thought it was strange, or they thought it was interesting or thought-provoking, or that it almost made sense to them, and they thought that was something I was going to love. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But it's really interesting to me how often that happens. And I guess, I know, I'm generally considered a little odd. There's not one thing people can define like, oh, he is this one thing. But then sometimes I will do something or say something, and the people around me are like, yeah, that's so Jeremy. I'm like, what does that mean? They're like, I don't know. It's just, that's you. So I have said to a number of friends of mine who are therapists, I think I might be somewhere on the spectrum. And this was before neurodiversity was really a thing that people heard about. Everyone just knew of the spectrum. And they always looked at me and they're like, no. And then I would see them start thinking, they're like, but you're on the edge of it. So I guess I'm kind of maybe sort of on the edge of the spectrum or close to it. So now what I'm best described as in today's terms is neurodiverse. But what the heck does that mean? Let's get into it. In episode 31, Matt Zakreski, he specializes in neurodiversity, and he describes it in more detail, but generally it's a non-medical term. It's an umbrella term that describes people with variation in their mental functions, right? So that's everyone. Everyone's got variation in their mental functions. The way it's often described as examples are autism, ADHD, which is a total misnomer, and we'll get into that later, dyslexia, and a few other things that have names. And usually when they're talking about it, they talk about people may struggle with soft skills such as emotional intelligence, as well as social interactions and being in groups. And they'll say things like, it starts to place certain individuals at a disadvantage and they may struggle to keep up in school. So it tends to be very focused on the negative. Here's a description that I like a lot better from the Cleveland Clinic. The term neurodivergent describes people whose brain differences affect how their brain works. That means that they have different strengths and challenges from people whose brains don't have those differences, right? It's different, which inherently anything that's different is going to have both strengths and challenges. So I like that. And my question, would you rather be unique or typical? Neurotypical seems like the better thing, but in my life, I've always found that being unique is more fun and entertaining and interesting than being typical. So being non-neurotypical for me is fine. And Matt Zakreski, again, has a wonderful explanation of it. When he talks about being neurodivergent, he said, imagine being 6'8". You can look at all the negatives because if you're 6'8", every single door that you walk through, you need to duck. No one else needs to duck. Most people don't need to duck. You need to duck every time. If you go to sit on an airplane, I can't imagine. I'm 6'2", 6'3", somewhere in there, and airplanes are no fun for me. Being 6'8", it must be a nightmare. But is that all you're going to focus on? How difficult it is to sit on airplanes and walk through doors? No. What if you think about 6'8" person playing basketball? What an advantage. Volleyball too, swimming, depending on your body type, maybe football. A lot of the football players are really tall and big. Or just silly things like the Bumble, putting stars on Christmas trees, or getting things off the top shelf. I actually have been stopped a number of times by people in grocery stores asking if I could get something off the top shelf for them. So what an advantage. if you look at it that way. So why don't we? Another question that this made me think about is left-handed. Left-handedness, is that a neurodiversity? Is that something that has challenges? Sure. Being left-handed, if you are an English speaker and you're writing, you are pushing the pen across the paper rather than pulling it. It causes more smudges. You have different sports equipment, different tools. There can be challenges, but it's not something that we've looked at over all this time and said, oh, that person's left-handed. That's a diversity. No, it's just a trait. It's not something to complain about. It's not really something to be overcome. It's just a trait. And interestingly, I started looking at it, and it has nothing to do with your hands. You can look at the hands of a left-handed or right-handed person, and you're not going to notice any difference, maybe calluses. But it's in the brain. It turns out that 28% of people who are on the autism spectrum are left-handed, and the average is 10. If you look at the general population of people who are either left-handed or mixed use, that 10 goes up to 18%. So 8% are mixed use. The general population, it's 18%. For people with autism, it's 62%. With people with ADHD, it's 27%. So people who are considered neurodiverse are much more likely to be left-handed. So is left-handedness something that you would look at people and say, oh yeah, they're different than me, I'm not sure I want to work with them, or not sure I want to hire them? No. You would look at someone who's left-handed and say, oh, it's a thing. It may affect them, it may not. Can they do the job? So let's look at all of neurodiversity that way, like it's left-handedness. It doesn't have to be something that you judge people on. It's just something to notice. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm looking for a job and I state my qualifications. I have a bad memory. If I meet you and I shake your hand, it's almost guaranteed that by the time I've let go of your hand, I've forgotten your name. Now, I also travel a lot for work. And when I go to the airport and I get on the shuttle, they'll ask what airline I'm on and where I'm going. And very often, I don't know. I'll say, hold on. And then I'll pull out my itinerary and I'll say, oh, it's whatever airline and I'm going to whatever city it is. So I've got a bad memory. I don't take direction well. I really don't like people giving me direction. I don't follow them. I'm not good at it. I'm much better at starting projects than I am at finishing them. And I don't particularly like being around people. Now, if you heard those things, would you ever hire me? My answer is probably no. Because we looked at it that one certain way. What if we look at it the other way? So I've got a bad memory, but I'm actually pretty smart. I don't tend to pay attention to details. Instead, I pay attention to the big picture. And I realize that I need to have some systems in place to make sure that details don't get missed, like having the itinerary when I go to the airport. I don't take direction well, but I'm a really good self-starter. If you give me a goal, I don't need a lot of direction. I'm going to just get there. I'm better at starting projects than I am at finishing them. I am a big old idea generator. I am coming up with ideas all the time. Quite often, they're good ones, if I do say so myself, and I do. And if I'm working with someone else who is better at the execution and delivery, then it's a great trait to have. I don't like people necessarily. I'm very introverted. I'm kind of shy, but I can spend a lot of time doing things like research, writing, and or podcasting. So if you heard the first description, would you ever want to hire me? Probably not. If you heard the second set of descriptions, would you want to hire me? Maybe. I hope so. I'll give you another example. There's a teenager I know. When he was young, he was diagnosed with ADD, and he definitely had issues in school. But ADD, if you think about what that means, attention deficit disorder. His issue, why he was diagnosed with ADD, is that when he was in school, he would get so distracted that it would frustrate him and he would kind of act out. The actual issue was that he was paying much more attention than the kids around him, and the kids around him were playing games, throwing stuff, talking. That's what was distracting him from being able to pay attention, which he wanted to do. So he got frustrated, and that's why he acted out. They gave him an accommodation, and the accommodation was that he got to sit on the edge instead of in the middle of the room. So he got to sit towards the back, where if the other kids were really distracting and frustrating him, he could stand up, quietly walk back, and continue paying attention while they weren't. So the actual issue was not that he had an attention deficit. It's that he was much better at paying attention than the other kids. And he got frustrated with them because they were distracting him and not allowing him to pay as much attention as he wanted. So he didn't have the deficit. They had the deficit. Is it a disorder? I don't think so. It's actually quite a strength. His ability to sit down and concentrate for extended periods of time on minute details is amazing, and the things he can do with it are astounding. So is it a disorder? No. Is it a strength? Absolutely. So again, it's misnamed. It's not a deficit. It's not a disorder. And today, every time someone has ADD, they seem to add H in there, which is for hyperactivity. Is he hyperactive? Nope. It just gets added on. I guess my point is, be careful with these labels and be careful with what they mean, because they don't always mean what you think they do. So when we're thinking about the labels of neurodiversity or on the spectrum or ADD or whatever it is, don't assume that it's a weakness. The example of ADD is a good one. It looked like a weakness to the teacher because he was getting so frustrated in the classroom. It seemed like he was having a hard time paying attention. Really, all he wanted to do was pay attention, and the other kids were making it impossible. One other thing not to do is to use it as an excuse. I hear people say all the time, well, I'm neurodiverse or I'm neurodivergent. It's not an excuse. Embrace it. Embrace the difference. Embrace the difference in other people and embrace the difference in yourself and find the strengths in it. Again, just because it's a difference doesn't mean it's a weakness. It can definitely be a strength. So you do have to learn to adapt to the challenges that your difference has. If you're 6'8", you do have to duck every time you see a doorway. It's just a difference. You have to adapt to it. But there's a lot of times when that difference can also be a strength, and we need to learn to identify those and embrace them. I'm going to give you a couple of resources. Episodes 9, 11, and 13. I personally talk about the differences within the Myers-Briggs assessment, and they're short episodes. I talk about myself and examples, and I'll talk about one dimension at a time. Episode 18 with Michael Segovia, he's the actual expert from the Myers-Briggs company. He goes into all of them and explains what they mean in more detail. That's a really good episode, episode 18. And I've mentioned Matt Zakreski in episode 31. He does a good job of defining neurodivergence and talking about what it is. Two other episodes I'll recommend are 16 and 36. 16 is with Michael Whitehouse. He talks about the power of authenticity, and Nick Redmond, she is a voice coach in episode 36 and talks about using your authentic voice. So authenticity is a big thing. If you can embrace who you are and authentically be that, it goes a long way. The other thing that Michael Whitehouse has a separate podcast. It's no longer running because he had enough episodes where he covered what he wanted to. It's called NeuroDiversity Superpowers. I recommend that one. Go take a listen to it. If you feel like you're neurodiverse and it's an issue for you, go and listen to that, and he will talk about and give examples of how they can be strengths. As I wrap up, why do I focus on the STEM workplace in particular, and especially engineers? Partly because my background's engineering. I got my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, so it just kind of made sense. And engineers and other STEM people tend to have some form of neurodiversity. It's a tendency. It's not always. Very often, they're more logical than most people. And when you are much more logical, then you're paying less attention to emotions. And you'll hear the term emotional intelligence when talking about soft skills. If you're more focused on logic, then your quote unquote emotional intelligence is likely to be lower. It's something that can definitely be learned, though. So it's just a tendency, not a sentence. They tend to be more detail oriented than most people, and they need to be in order to get things done. You need to pay attention to the details. So those things and some others can make communication for science people and engineers and technology people more of an issue at work. So my question for you is, do you know any engineers who are managers or engineers who have to work with people in different divisions? So they need to develop more of the quote unquote soft skills or the people skills. I'd love to have a conversation with them. And I want to see if there's any way I can help. So what I would love it is if you can send both of us an email and introduce us. My email is jdoran@neuroconversantleadership.com. Copy the other person, give us an introduction, and I would love to start a conversation. Thank you again for listening. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this. And this episode is going to drop on the 4th of July. So I hope you have fun and stay safe.